For a bit more analysis now, I'm joined on the set by France 24's Oliver Farry. Oliver, where do things stand now in Iran 1 year after those protests began?
Well, the protests were the largest in Iran since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. They haven't completely died out. There is certainly, at least in spirit and at least online, there is a contestation still there, but they're definitely not on the same scale or as visible as they were only a few months ago. The main reason for that is the clampdown. There have been hundreds of well-publicised deaths. We don't have a clearly established death toll, but it stands in the hundreds. According to the NGO Human Rights Activists in Iran, at least 530 protesters have been killed and at least 7 people have been executed for their roles in demonstrations. Dozens of others have been subject to others still have death sentences hanging over them, and tens of thousands have been subject to arbitrary arrest. Now, those are overwhelmingly young people, even though the protests themselves did really straddle the generations in Iran. The protests, of course, were driven by the desire for Iranian women for greater rights, symbolised by casting off the hijab, which tens of thousands of Iranian women did. Now, unlike in most Muslim countries, the hijab is compulsory in Iran and is very zealously enforced by the country's morality police. The rallying call, of course, was woman, life, freedom. But for the authorities, the protest against the hijab actually transcends the hijab itself. It's a lot more important than that. It probably represents for them the first cracks in the edifice of their power. And this is why they've come down on it so firmly. They've clamped down on the protests using constitutional measures as well. They now have a hijab and chastity bill, which is working its way through Parliament and which uses deterrents such as large fines to enforce the hijab.
Oliver, what about the international community? It's had little leverage over the regime in Iran. Is there any way that could change, do you think, moving forward?
It's hard to see what will happen. Iran's moves are a reflection of what other authoritarian governments have done elsewhere in the world, such as China, Russia and Belarus, in the face of protests. But the regime in Tehran is a particularly bloody one in comparison. It is giving a legalistic patina to the crackdown with this bill that I mentioned earlier. But unlike those other governments, it's not so concerned with optics. It doesn't really care what Western governments think. It makes use of paramilitary groups such as the Basiji to intimidate and kill prisoners and protesters, rather, sometimes in quite shocking ways. So Western governments have added further sanctions against Iran for its human rights violations during the protests. Now, previous sanctions have generally focused on Iran's nuclear program. They were resumed by Washington after the Trump administration's unilateral suspension of the Iran deal in 2018. So there have been calls for Western governments to break off these relations, diplomatic relations. But as we saw last week, the Biden administration was involved in a prison transfer with Iran. So even if there might be some leeway for Western governments, they still want to use this in other ways.